Abilene, Texas, 1883. The air inside the Silver Spur Saloon was thick with cigar smoke and the sour stench of spilled whiskey. Cowboys laughed too loud, cards slapped against wooden tables, and the piano in the corner played a tune that no one really listened to. At the center of it all sat Jeb Callahan, a broad-shouldered rancher with a reputation as hard as the land he worked. He was a man who had lost too much, his parents to fever, his brother to a range war, and his heart to bitterness. Folks said Jeb didn't believe in love, only in land, cattle, and the weight of a good wager. That night, with a whiskey glass in hand and pride burning in his chest, Jeb made a bet that would change his life forever. "I'll marry her," he said, his voice carrying over the din of the saloon. "Rose Harper, the widow, the one nobody else wants." The room went quiet for a moment, then erupted in laughter. Rose Harper was known in town, quiet, plain, and often the subject of cruel whispers. Since her husband's death, she had lived on the edge of town, tending a small, failing ranch. To many she was invisible, to others she was a joke. But Jeb wasn't joking. He slapped his hand down on the table. 50 acres and my best stallion says I'll have her as my wife before the month is out." The men roared with approval, slapping his back, eager to see the spectacle. To them, it was entertainment. To Jeb, it was just another gamble. What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Rose Harper was no fool. And the moment she said yes, she would begin a quiet war that would shake Jeb Callahan to his very core. The gossip spread faster than prairie fire. By the next morning, every shopkeeper, ranch hand, and church lady in Abilene knew about Jeb Callahan's outrageous bet. Some laughed, some shook their heads, but most pitied the poor widow who would soon be humiliated. Rose Harper heard it too. She was in the general store, her hands wrapped around a sack of flour she could barely afford, when two women whispered loud enough for her to hear. "Imagine it," one said, smirking, "marrying her for land and a horse. That's all she's worth." Rose's cheeks burned, but she didn't flinch. She had endured worse since her husband's death. The town had always seen her as plain, fragile, and destined to fade away. But inside her, a quiet fire had been building, one that no one had noticed. That evening, Jeb himself rode up to her weather-beaten ranch. The place was falling apart, fences broken, roof sagging, fields choked with weeds. He dismounted, boots crunching on dry earth, and tipped his hat with a smirk that wasn't polite. "Rose," he said, his voice low and steady, "I've come to make you a proposal." She studied him, her gray eyes sharp as a hawk's. "A proposal," she repeated, her tone flat. "Or a wager?" The words hit him like a slap. For a moment Jeb's grin faltered. He hadn't expected her to know. But Rose always knew more than people gave her credit for. "I'll not lie," he said finally. "There was talk in the saloon. But I'm a man of my word. I'll give you a home, a name, and protection. Better than scraping by out here alone." Rose's silence stretched long enough for the wind to whistle through the broken shutters. Then, to Jeb's surprise, she nodded. "I'll marry you," she said. Jeb blinked. He had expected resistance, maybe even tears. But her calm acceptance unsettled him. He didn't know that behind her steady gaze, Rose was already planning. She would not be anyone's joke. If he thought she was weak, he was about to learn just how wrong he was. And so within a week, the town gathered in the small white church to witness the strangest wedding Abilene had ever seen. Some came to laugh, others to gawk, but all came certain of one thing. This marriage was doomed before it began. What they didn't know was that the real story was only just beginning. The church bells of Abilene rang hollow that Sunday afternoon, their echoes drifting across the dry plains. Inside the little white chapel, the townsfolk packed the pews, whispering behind gloved hands and smirking behind mustaches. To them, this wasn't a wedding, it was theater. Rose Harper walked down the aisle in a simple, faded blue dress. It wasn't silk, it wasn't lace, but it was clean, pressed, and carried with it a quiet dignity. She held no flowers, only her chin high. Every eye in the room followed her, some with pity, most with ridicule. At the altar stood Jeb Callahan, tall and broad, his black hat resting on the pew beside him. He looked every bit the rancher, confident, unyielding, and utterly sure of himself. But when Rose's eyes met his, something flickered there. Not fear, not regret, but a strange unease. She wasn't trembling. She wasn't ashamed. She looked at him as though she knew something he didn't. The preacher's words were short, the vows even shorter. When Jeb said, "I do," the crowd chuckled. When Rose said it, the room fell silent. Her voice was steady, clear, and carried farther than anyone expected. By sundown, the two rode back to Jeb's sprawling ranch. The land stretched wide and wild, fences strong, cattle grazing in the distance. It was a kingdom compared to Rose's crumbling homestead. Yet as they entered the big ranch house, the silence between them was heavier than the desert heat. Jeb poured himself a drink, leaning against the mantel. "You've got a roof over your head now," he said gruffly. "Food on the table." "You won't want for anything," Rose set her small bag down by the door. "Except respect," she replied. The words cut sharper than a knife. Jeb turned, his jaw tightening. No woman had ever spoken to him like that, not even his late mother. He expected gratitude, maybe even meekness. Instead, he found steel. At night, in the dim glow of a single oil lamp, Jeb waited for Rose to play the part of the obedient bride. But Rose had other plans. She sat at the edge of the bed, her back straight, her eyes fixed on him. "You think I don't know about your bet?" she said quietly. Jeb froze. "I heard it all," she continued. "The stallion, the land, the laughter. You married me for a wager, Jeb Callahan. But you should know something. I agreed for my own reasons." He narrowed his eyes. "And what reasons are those?" Rose leaned forward, her voice low but unshakable. "Because I don't intend to be pitied anymore. I don't intend to be whispered about in stores or laughed at in saloons. You wanted a wife for a bet? Fine. But I'll make sure this marriage costs you more than 50 acres and a horse. I'll make sure it changes you." For the first time in years, Jeb Callahan didn't know what to say. He had faced outlaws, droughts, and stampedes, but never a woman who looked him dead in the eye and promised a fight. And as the lamp flickered, casting long shadows across the room, Jeb realized something unsettling. Rose Harper wasn't the weak widow he thought she was. She was a storm, quiet for now, but gathering strength. The bet had been his idea. But the game now belonged to her. The first days of marriage were colder than the desert nights. Jeb Callahan, proud and stubborn, treated Rose with the courtesy of a business arrangement. He gave her a roof, meals, and silence. He expected her to stay out of his way, to fade into the background like a shadow in his big ranch house. But Rose Harper was no shadow. On the very first morning, she rose before dawn. While Jeb still slept, she lit the stove, boiled coffee, and stepped outside into the biting chill. The ranch stretched before her, vast, powerful, but neglected in ways only a sharp eye could see. Fences sagged in places, the barn roof leaked, and the ranch hands, though loyal, worked without order or discipline. By the time Jeb came down for breakfast, Rose was already outside, sleeves rolled up, hammer in hand, repairing a broken gate. "What in blazes are you doing?" Jeb barked, half amused, half annoyed. Rose didn't look up. "What you should have done weeks ago," she replied. The ranch hands, watching from a distance, chuckled. They expected Jeb to explode, to put her in her place, but instead he just stood there, jaw tight, unable to find words. That was the beginning. Day after day, Rose worked. She mended fences, patched the barn roof, and organized supplies with a precision that startled the men. She cooked hearty meals not just for Jeb, but for every ranch hand, earning their respect bite by bite. She even rode out with them, skirts tucked, hair tied back, helping to drive cattle and check the far pastures. At first the men laughed, then they stopped laughing, then they started listening. Rose had ideas, clever ones. She suggested rotating the grazing fields to keep the grass from dying out. She showed them how to store water in barrels lined with tar to keep it from spoiling. She even taught them tricks she'd learned from her late husband about calming skittish horses. Slowly the ranch began to change. And Jeb noticed. One evening he came in from the fields, sweat and dust clinging to him, and found Rose at the big oak table with the ranch account spread before her. She had a pencil in hand, her brow furrowed in concentration. "You're looking at my books?" he asked, his tone sharp. Rose didn't flinch. "Your books are a mess. You're losing money on supplies you don't need and paying double for feed you could grow yourself." Jeb stepped closer, bristling. "That's my business." Rose finally looked up, her eyes steady. "Not anymore. It's ours." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Jeb opened his mouth to argue, but something in her gaze stopped him. She wasn't asking permission. She was claiming her place. That night, Jeb lay awake, staring at the ceiling. He had married Rose for a bet, expecting a burden, a joke, a woman too weak to matter. Instead, he had brought into his home a force of nature. She was changing his ranch, his men, and, though he would never admit it, something inside him. But pride is a stubborn thing. Jeb told himself it was temporary, that she would tire, that she would break. Yet deep down, a seed of doubt had been planted. And then came the fire. It started on a dry, windy afternoon, when a spark from a ranch hand's careless cigarette caught the brittle grass. Within minutes, flames roared across the pasture, devouring everything in their path. The men panicked, shouting, running for water buckets too small to matter. Jeb mounted his horse, barking orders, but the fire was too fast, too wild. It threatened not only the cattle but the ranch house itself. And in the chaos, it was Rose who took command. "Cut a fire break," she shouted, her voice carrying over the roar of the flames. "Plow a line through the field. Now! Drive the cattle toward the riverbed. Move!" The men hesitated, stunned that a woman was giving orders. But her voice was sharp, commanding, undeniable. And when she grabbed a plow horse herself and began carving a line through the burning field, they followed. For hours they fought the fire together, sweat and smoke choking their lungs, flames licking at their boots. Rose never faltered. She hauled water, swung an axe, and shouted orders until her voice was raw. By nightfall, the fire was beaten back. The ranch still stood. The cattle were safe. The men exhausted and blackened with soot. looked at Rose with something new in their eyes, respect. And Jeb, he stood in the glow of the dying embers, staring at his wife as though seeing her for the first time. She was no plain widow, no pitiful woman. She was strength, grit, and fire itself. For the first time in his life, Jeb Callahan felt something he couldn't gamble, couldn't wager, couldn't control. He felt awe. The wildfire had left its scars across the Callahan ranch. Blackened earth, charred fence posts, and the acrid smell of smoke that lingered for weeks. But it had also left something else. Whispers. At first, the talk in Abilene was the same as always. Callahan's fool bet, they said. That poor widow dragged into a marriage she didn't want. But then the ranch hands came into town, their boots still black with soot, and told a different story. They told of how Rose Harper had stood in the flames, shouting orders like a general, saving cattle and land that would have been lost without her. They told of how she had worked harder than any man, her hands blistered, her dress singed, her face streaked with ash, and how she never once faltered. The story spread like wildfire of its own, and for the first time, people began to look at Rose not with pity, but with curiosity. A week later, Rose walked into the general store, the same place where she had once overheard cruel whispers. This time the room fell silent. The shopkeeper, Mr. Dugan, cleared his throat nervously. "Mrs. Callahan," he said, using her married name with a respect that surprised even him. "We've got a new shipment of seed in. Finest quality. I'll give you a fair price." Rose studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Fair price is all I ask." The women who had once mocked her stood by the shelves, pretending to examine bolts of fabric. But their eyes followed her, and for the first time, there was no smirk, no sneer, only something closer to admiration. On Sunday, Rose and Jeb walked into the small white church together, the pews filled with townsfolk who had come not to laugh this time, but to see. Rose wore the same blue dress she had been married in, patched now at the hem, but she carried herself with quiet pride. The preacher paused mid-sermon when he saw them. "Mr. and Mrs. Callahan," he said warmly, "we're glad to have you." Rose felt the eyes of the congregation on her, but instead of shrinking, she lifted her chin. She sang the hymns with a clear voice, her words steady, her presence undeniable. And when a service ended, people approached her, not to whisper, but to shake her hand. Meanwhile, back at the ranch, Jeb was wrestling with something he had never faced before: doubt. He watched Rose from a distance as she worked alongside the men, her hair tied back, her hands calloused, her laughter ringing across the fields. The ranch hands respected her now, sometimes even turning to her before they turned to him. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in streaks of red and gold, Jeb found himself standing beside her at the corral. "You've changed things," he said quietly. Rose didn't look at him. She leaned on the fence, watching the horses. "No, Jeb. I just reminded everyone what could be done if someone cared enough to try." Her words stung, because he knew they were true. For years, he had run the ranch with brute force and stubborn pride, never thinking of it as more than land and cattle. But Rose saw it differently. To her, it was life, community, survival. And slowly, against his will, Jeb began to see it that way too. The final shift came one evening in the very place where it had all begun, the Silver Spur Saloon. Jeb walked in, as he always did, but this time the laughter died down. Men who had once slapped his back and cheered his bet now looked at him differently, not with mockery, but with something closer to respect. Callahan, one of them said, raising a glass, heard your wife saved half your ranch. Jeb's jaw tightened. He wanted to deny it, to claim the credit, but the truth was too big to ignore. He nodded once. She did. The men exchanged glances. One of them chuckled. Well, I'll be damned. Guess you got more than you bargained for. Jeb didn't answer. He just finished his drink and left, the weight of their words heavy on his shoulders. That night back at the ranch, Jeb sat alone by the fire. The bet that had once seemed like a game now felt like a chain around his neck. He had married Rose for pride, for land, for a stallion. But now he realized the stakes were far higher. Rose wasn't just his wife by name. She was the heart of the ranch, the respect of the men, the talk of the town. She was becoming everything he wasn't, and everything he needed. And for the first time, Jeb Callahan felt fear. Not of losing land or cattle or even his reputation, but of losing her. Because deep down, though he would never admit it aloud, Jeb was beginning to feel something he had sworn he'd never feel again. He was beginning to love her. The Callahan ranch had begun to thrive under Rose's hand. The cattle were healthier, the books balanced, and the men worked with a discipline that surprised even themselves. The town of Abilene, once cruel in its whispers, now spoke of Rose Harper Callahan with respect. Some even with admiration. But prosperity has a way of stirring envy. And envy in the Wild West was as dangerous as a loaded gun. One evening, as the sun bled red across the horizon, a rider appeared at the edge of the Callahan ranch. Dust clung to his coat, and his eyes carried the cold gleam of a man who had nothing to lose. His name was Eli Turner, a gambler, drifter, and the very man who had goaded Jeb into making the infamous bet in the Silver Spur Saloon. Eli dismounted slowly, his grin sharp as a knife. Well, well, he drawled. If it ain't Mr. and Mrs. Callahan, looks like the joke turned serious. Jeb stiffened, his hand twitching near his belt. You've got no business here, Turner. But Eli only laughed. No business? I'd say I've got plenty. You see, Jeb, a bet's a bet. And I reckon the whole town deserves to know the truth, that you married this woman for land and a horse, that she ain't your wife out of love, but out of pride. Rose's face went pale, though her eyes burned with fury. She had known about the bet, yes, but hearing it thrown into the open, with Eli's mocking tone, was a wound deeper than she expected. That night, after Eli rode off, with promises to spread his poison in town, Rose confronted Jeb in the ranch house. You never told me, she said, her voice trembling but steady. You never told me it was Eli who pushed you into it, that the whole town was laughing at me before I even said I do. Jeb's jaw tightened. I didn't think it mattered. You knew it was a bet. Rose's hands clenched at her sides. It matters, Jeb. It matters because you let me walk into that church with every eye on me, every whisper cutting me down, and you said nothing. You let me be the fool. Jeb tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat. For the first time, he saw the depth of the wound he had caused. He had thought Rose strong enough to bear it, and she was. But strength did not erase pain. You don't understand, he said finally, his voice low. I never meant for it to go this far. I never meant for you to... He stopped himself, unable to finish. To what? Rose demanded. To matter? The silence that followed was heavier than any words. True to his word, Eli Turner spread the story. Within days, the whispers returned. In the saloon, in the church, in the general store, people spoke of Rose not as the woman who saved the ranch, But as the woman who had been bought in a dare, some pitied her again, others mocked her, and though many still respected her grit, the poison of Eli's words was hard to wash away. Rose bore it with her usual steel, but inside something cracked. She had fought so hard to build a life of dignity, only to have it ripped away by the truth of Jeb's cruelty. One night, unable to sleep, Rose stood on the porch, staring out at the moonlit fields. Jeb joined her, his hat in his hands, his face drawn. "You should have told me," she whispered. "I was a fool," Jeb admitted. "I thought it was just a game. But it stopped being a game the moment you walked into my house. You've done more for this ranch, for me, than I ever deserved. And He hesitated, the words foreign on his tongue. "I don't know how to make it right." Rose turned to him, her eyes glistening. "You can't make it right, Jeb. You can only decide what kind of man you're going to be from here on out." Her words cut deep because they were true. Jeb had lived his life on pride, wagers, and stubbornness. But now for the first time, he realized he had something worth losing, something no bet could win back. And then came the final blow. The next morning, as Rose was tending the garden, Eli Turner returned. Not with threats, but with a revelation. He leaned against the fence, his grin cruel. "You think you know your husband, Rose? Let me tell you something. That stallion he wagered, he lost it weeks ago, before he even married you. He didn't have the right to bet it in the first place." Rose froze, her heart pounding. "What are you saying?" Eli's grin widened. "I'm saying Jeb Callahan didn't just gamble with your dignity. He gambled with lies. He married you on a bet he couldn't even pay." The words struck like a bullet. Rose staggered back, her breath catching. She had known Jeb was reckless, but this was betrayal layered on betrayal. When Jeb returned that evening, he found Rose waiting, her face pale, her eyes blazing. "Is it true?" she demanded. Jeb's silence was answer enough. And in that moment, Rose Harper Callahan made a decision. She would no longer be the woman defined by a bet, by whispers, by a man's pride. She would take control of her life, her ranch, and her future, with or without Jeb Callahan. The storm had broken, and nothing would ever be the same again. The morning after Rose's ultimatum, Jeb rode into town alone. He found Eli Turner in the saloon, boasting of his lies. Without a word, Jeb slammed him against the bar and declared before the whole room, "I married Rose Harper on a bet." That's the truth. But I'll tell you something else. It's the only bet I ever won that mattered. She saved my ranch, my men, and me. And if any man here dares laugh at her again, he'll answer to me. The room fell silent. Eli slunk away, his smirk gone. When Jeb returned home, Rose stood waiting. He removed his hat, his voice rough but steady. "I was a fool, but I don't want to bet, Rose. I want a wife. I want you, if you'll still have me." For a long moment, she studied him. Then with a faint smile, she said, "This time, Jeb Callahan, it won't be for land or a horse. It'll be for love, and that's a wager worth keeping." The ranch thrived, the town's whispers turned to respect, and the widow once mocked became the heart of Abilene. And Jeb Callahan, the man who thought he could gamble with a woman's life, learned the greatest truth of all. Some bets cost you everything, but the right woman can give you more than you ever dreamed.